Right, welcome everyone. We're now on part 6, I think we're on, of our accountancy bookkeeping software called Small Accounts. And to date, if you've been watching, you'll notice that we've managed to get a list of accounts up, just as you would in a normal CRUD application. CRUD is an acronym for create, read, update and delete. So the 4 actions you do with data. Some people know it as BREAD, which is browse, read, edit, add, delete. Yeah, but we normally CRUD. It's one and the same, just different things you do. So that gives us our list of nominal accounts which we can put CRUD items to, or CRUD actions. But then we created our trial balance, and we artificially created the values here in our database in order to produce our trial balance, which, as you should know from an accountancy point of view, always should equal the same one column to the other. And we're going to see in this video how we set it up enforces that rule. Before we do, I should have prepared this actually, but I wanted to talk to you about something about the fundamentals of the bookkeeping side of things, and it's something called T accounts. So I just want to briefly show you this. So that might not be the best picture. Is that a better one? Let's have a look. Yeah, okay. So hopefully you can see this. These are T accounts, and if you've done, I think I've just clicked something there. If you've done any kind of bookkeeping for a company, your own family company, or for someone else, or your own bookkeeping company, whatever it is, you probably haven't even seen one of these unless you've had accountancy or bookkeeping training of some sort. Probably more bookkeeping training. But T accounts, it gets its name from this T shape here, and I don't know the details of the history of it. I've done a bit of research on it, but this T account system was something that's been employed to utilize the idea of recording transactions in such a way that the data remains integral. In other words, it's not missing, it doesn't misadd up, and it's a very simple system, but you wouldn't normally see it like this. If you were doing books for a company or for yourself, you wouldn't normally do it like this. But what you might find is, if you were troubleshooting a set of accounts for someone, or even your own, T accounts can become very useful, and it's because T accounts are the very core essence of what bookkeeping is all about. If you are using what's known as the double entry system, and this is very important. This idea of the double entry system is very, very important. It's sort of the backbone of pretty much most, if not all, accounting systems today. But it actually started off hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. I'm not sure how far back, but definitely many, many hundreds of years. And the idea behind the double entry system was that essentially for every transaction you put somewhere, there's an equal and opposite transaction value somewhere else. So in other words, every transaction that takes place, there's 2 ends to that transaction. There's always 2 ends that you can trace it to. And because you've got 2 ends to the transaction for the same amount, it means that, remember earlier we said the trial balance, the 2 columns, the debit and the credit, always add up. Well, ultimately, the transaction ends appear in the debit and the credit. So no matter where that transaction is, it's going to be a debit in one and a credit in the other, but it'll still ultimately add up in the debit and credit column at the bottom of the trial balance. So that double entry system enforces the idea that the trial balance always does balance. If a trial balance doesn't balance, then that rule has been broken. The equal and opposite value rule hasn't been done somewhere. Now, that's the straightforward answer. It gets a little bit more complicated because we can start. You may think, well, that's okay for videos. That's okay for transactions where there is only one either end of a transaction. So if I'm not VAT registered, for example, and I sell £100 worth of stuff, Well, I've one end of the transaction is the sales of 100, and the other end of the transaction is my bank account, which is the 100. So the two ends of the transaction. But what if you've got VAT on that item? So if I sell an item for £100 and I charge VAT, then my bank account goes up by £120, but my sales has only gone up by 100, which means the VAT account has to go up by 20. But now we've got three accounts. How do we balance that? So this is where we're going to address this as part of the nominal transaction. This isn't a tutorial on bookkeeping. I just want to get you to understand that nominal transactions at its very core basically link two accounts at either end of it, and because of that they will always balance off. So if you take this one for example, I've just randomly pulled it up from the internet. So here's a transaction here. So they're in American notation. So July the 1st, so July the 1st they've paid rent, so that goes as an expense in their rent account, but it goes into their creditors account as 10,000, so they now owe that rent to a creditor. So the debit's gone up by $10,000, the credit's gone up by $10,000, so even after this transaction it still balances the same. It's not altered the left-right balance. And that's the idea behind T accounts, is it helps enforce that rule of double entry. So we're going to see that as we go through in how we set up our accounts. So let's get rid of that. Don't worry if you didn't get that, by the way, it will be explained as we go through the code. But the first thing we need to do is create our nominal model, nominal transaction model. So artisan make model with a migration, and put it in the models folder, and we'll call it nominal transaction. Okay, so that creates us our migration and our model. So let's see what can we do with this. I think let's go back to the app. So at the minute we've hard coded these values in. Let's set them back to 0. Let's set them back to 0. Okay, so we'll go on the basis that at midnight last night the balance was 0. We're now going to enter a nominal transaction. That's going to be added to the last night's balance, which in this case is 0, and then that's going to be presented on the trial balance, and then that will give us an up-to-date trial balance. So what we'll do is we'll create a dummy transaction in the seeder for now, again just so that we don't have to keep writing it out each time. So let's see, we need to use nominal transaction, and then nominal transaction create, and we're going to create one here. Now we haven't actually set up the migration with the fields for this, so it's probably best if we do that. So let's think about this. What's the bare, for every transaction, what's the bare amount of information to get going with for now that we need? Well, this is where we need to think about enforcing the double entry system. So there is one way of doing it. When I was working this out, I thought of two ways this could be done. Let me just bring up my spreadsheet. Okay, let's just bring up a blank spreadsheet here. Okay, so there's two ways of doing this. So remember we said we were going to enforce the double entry. Now that's critical, okay? So here's one way of doing this. For each transaction we could have a nominal account a debit, a credit, a date. Yeah, that's sort of the bare minimum for now. So with these bits of information, we could create the very bare minimum nominal transaction. So how this would work is I could say, okay, let's have a look at my codes. So sales, let's say I make sales of 100 and that goes into the bank. So I could say, okay, my nominal account sales on today's date, so that's 2nd of May 2020, and also in the bank balance, we'll just copy that date. So these two, each one of these would represent one of these nominal transactions that we've just set up in the code here. So this would mean the debit column, if these two transactions were, applied and added to the current balance, so that would basically add 100 to the debit and 100 to the credit in total, but it would add them to these two accounts respectively. So that would work. But I think there's a better way of doing this to enforce the double entry, and it's basically, if for example the data got corrupted and that went to 50, well, you're having to trace that then. You're having to sort of say, well, why is one figure out which one? How do you know which is the right figure in order to make it balance? Do I change that to 50 or do I change that to 100? See, I know that's probably something you could easily find out, but the problem is there is a potential for that to happen and for the data to be wrong. So here's another way of doing it. Why don't we say, let's put the date in here, let's put the amount in here, then let's put the debit in here and the credit here. So if we said, let's copy this date, copy, paste, the date, the amount, well, let's just change that to 100. The debit is the bank and the credit is, oh, sales would be good. Let's go with sales. It's the keyboard, that's all I'm saying. There. So now, let me just align that. So why am I proposing this as another option? Well, if you think about this, if this amount, when we come to this transaction and we want to add it to the trial balance, what we'll do is say, okay, let's get the amount, let's apply that amount as a debit value to bank and that amount as a credit value to sales. Because we're only using one amount on any given transaction, it means we can't get the double entry wrong, because the same figure is going to be used for the debit and the credit. So we can't wrongly, inadvertently put unbalancing figures to the debit and credit side of the transaction, because we're only using one figure as its source of truth for that transaction. So the only thing that really we could get wrong here is that we assign it to the wrong code. But in reality, we could have done that here anyway. We could have assigned it to the wrong code. But the point of this is that the double entry can't break, because so long as everything updates correctly, which is obviously a coding issue and a database issue, but from a transaction point of view, this can't break the double entry because one value is evaluated to both sides of the transaction. So hopefully that will eliminate the problem of getting figures wrong, as we saw might have happened in this scenario here. Now, going back to the illustration we said earlier, just to say, well, what if VAT was introduced and we have that extra problem? You see, if we let's just add a few lines here. If we were going to do that here, so what we'd have is something like that. So £20 VAT will become a liability on the credit column, meaning we now owe that to the VAT man. How would that apply here? Well, we just add another line. So we could do this one of two ways. We could either say the original transaction was £120, but then the £20 we now need to debit sales and credit VAT. So what that means is sales got a credit of 120, but sales also got a debit of 20, which means the net effect is that sales gets £100 credit, which is the same as here. The bank gets £120 debit and VAT gets £20 credit. So you end up with the same structure as here, but one line less for a start, and we don't break that double entry system, or there's just no room for it to break at all. The other way we can do it is just go to 100 sales in the bank, and then we could just do 20 and then put the bank in there like that. So the bank eventually nets off at 120 debit, sales is 100 credit, VAT is 20 credit, and it adds up the same. So I mean, you know, we can decide that later on. Either way, each of the three accounts gets its relevant value. Now, the only issue with this that I can see is that in our history, when you're going through your bank statement, you're going to have a deposit on your actual physical bank statement. You're going to have a deposit of £120, whereas on your statement in your accounts program, you're going to have two separate entries, the £100 and the £20. Now, if you could live with that, then you could mark them off as separate items that make up the one figure. Or what we could do is wrap every set of transactions in like its own entity, and that entity sort of adds up all the corresponding account values and then uses that as the values to post into the correct entries. We'll come to that later. It's something I'm thinking of doing, but for now, don't worry about it. We're just going to live with two separate entries and we'll reconcile it as that, but we will come to that and address that later on. So hopefully you've been following with me, and hopefully if you can just think for a second, if this is how we're going to do our nominal transaction, what fields are we going to put into our model? Okay, so you would be correct if you thought integer, if you thought amount, I'll leave that as it is, and if you thought debit nominal account ID, hopefully you're familiar with this notation for Laravel, and credit nominal account ID. So because we can't leave them empty, it means that there has to be a code in each one, which means the double entry has to work. That's the idea. Now we don't need to put a date in here, or do we? Because the Laravel model, or the database, gives us an updated and a created at, but no, actually that's when the entry is put into the database, and it may well be that the transaction is for another date. So, but we don't really need the time. We don't need to put a timestamp on there, we just need the date as to what it refers to. So yeah, let's add a date column. So we'll put that at the beginning. No, actually we'll put it at the end. So we'll go table. I like to do this as past tense. So date. Can't say entered at, recorded at, accounted at. Just like to follow the Laravel convention. Okay, so that'll give us a date that we need to put in there. So that gives us our migration for the nominal transaction. Let's go to the model. Okay, what do I want to do now? So yeah, at the seed, sorry, not the model. So we said we're going to create a nominal transaction. So we're going to put an amount in of £100. Debit nominal account ID. Now, what we can do, I'll assign that to a variable, and then I can just say sales ID, and I can do the same for credit. What did we say? Bank balance. So I'll just call that bank. And we had a date, didn't we? Accounted at, we'll just put now. Okay. Now, oh yeah, what we also need to do is this little modification. So let's get our nominal transaction. Get amount attribute, set amount attribute, and that should be fine. Oh, why is he? Oh, the wrong ones. So if I'm getting it, I want to divide it by 100. If I'm setting it, I've copied the wrong one. Set. Set amount attribute. This attribute's amount equals value times 100. Yeah. Okay. So, do you know, this could work. Okay, let's try this. Oh, it could work, but it didn't. Oh, typo. A-double-M. Typo. Where are we? A-double-M there. Probably saw it and was screaming it out. Let's try again. Okay, so that's worked. So let's have a look in the database now. Nominal accounts are the same, but we now have nominal transactions with an amount, a debit of 1 and a credit of 5. So debit of sales and a credit of bank balance. Oh, have I put them the wrong way round? I've put them the wrong way around. The debit should be the bank, which is 5. Oops. Okay. See if that fixes it. So refresh that. Let's have a look. Yeah, so the debit's now the bank, the credit is the sales. Okay, but obviously we haven't introduced that into our trial balance yet, so that's no good. So let's see. We could. Okay, what I'm going to do, and for those of you who know what to do here, please don't shout at me. But what I'm going to do first of all is just add it in here in the controller. So we've got our nominal accounts. Actually, no, that's not even easy to do that. I'm going to do it extremely long-winded, okay? Deliberately. But we will refactor this to a much better solution. But I just want you to see what's going on. So let me do this the long-winded way, and then we'll come back to it later. So we got our accounts, but I also want our nominal transactions. Excuse me, nominal transactions equals nominal transaction all. Let's just add the nominal transaction here. Where are we? Trial balance, yeah. Nominal transactions all. So now what I want to do is I need to loop over each of the transactions. This is extremely long-winded. I do apologise. For each nominal transactions as nominal transaction, we now need to this is killing me to do this. For each nominal counts as nominal account. Yes, I know some of you will be screaming right now, what are you doing? What are you doing? But please bear with me. I'm just going to do this the long way around and then fix it later. So what we're going to do is loop over each of the transactions, which we know at the minute to be this one, and then we're going to loop over the nominal accounts. We're going to check for each debit and credit value here. We're going to check against the ID, and if it is the ID, we're going to add the debit or the credit accordingly to it before we pass out that, so that gets added out later. So I'm going to add a key, so key T and key A. You see why in a moment. So we need to check if it's the matching. So if nominal transaction debit nominal account ID equals nominal account ID, then nominal accounts key A, that's why we brought the key in, so we could identify it, debit equals, well, we should be able to say plus equals, which means just add this next value to it, and that will be nominal transaction amount. Equally, if the credit nominal account ID equals it, then credit, add that to the credit account. It's yucky, I know. Please bear with me. Okay, so I haven't reloaded it. I'm hoping that 100 will appear here and 100 will appear here, and then these will have 100 each. Yes, yes, okay, it's worked. So as you can see, the nominal accounts have a zero balance, but the transaction was added in to the corresponding code. So we will refactor that later, but this is great because what it means is it can take any balance up to a point and then just add in the latest transactions. So that way we're not having to worry about keeping two sets of data correct, but it also means that we're not having to add up the complete history of transactions every time we want to get a balance. We just get the last known update and add in any new from there. So that gives us our balance. So just to show this, let's go back to our seeder. So let's add a VAT account, for example, we talked about earlier. So name equals VAT, and then if we had, so let's say we added, so £120 was the full amount, and then we need to do something with the 20, don't we? So if the 120, oh, I've done it the other way there, so let's just undo that. Okay, so if the 120 is bank debit sales credit, 120 is bank debit sales credit, then the 20 is sales debit VAT credit. So the 20 is sales debit and VAT credit. So let's run the migration. Let's run our trial balance. So we have sales of 120 and 20, 120 in the bank, 20 VAT. Now, so the only issue we've got now here, as it stands, is that it's split this figure over the two. Now, you don't do that. We have to have it in one or the other. I'm not sure what the actual official instruction is for this, but many of the accounts sit in one column regardless, whether even if they go into a negative figure, they stay in that column and just go negative rather than switching over to the other side. So basically 120 minus 20 will give us the 100 sales, but equally you could have 120 and minus 20 in this column is the same as plus 20 in that column, because it produces the same net result. So we could say for a particular, any given account, that it should belong in a given column regardless of the amount it ends up at. So let's fix that. Let's fix that for this video. So okay, how can we do that? Let's go back to our nominal account controller. So in reality then, I suppose the best thing to do is for each account we specify the column that it defaults to regardless. So we could just put that in as a boolean, so we could say table boolean, boolean's just true or false. We'll call it default debit, or no, actually what we could do, we could be a bit clever here, we could just say default okay. So don't get this default here confused with these defaults here. What this basically means is which column should it report on by default, regardless of whether it's a plus or a minus figure. and we'll say by default, which is a coincidence, it's going to be the debit column, just so that we've got a column. It's not the most efficient way, but this could come in handy because we've now got the word debit or credit, which we could inject rather than checking if this. We could actually just inject the name to say use this column. So we'll try it this way, see how this works. So we've got, let's go back to our seeder. So we're going to have to put in, so by default it's debit, so the ones that are not default debit, which is only these two, I'm just going to change these to default. I'm just thinking actually whether the word default as a field name is a good idea. Alright, we'll leave it for now. If we get any errors we may have to change that. We'll leave it for now. Okay, so let's run the migration. So we now have a default column name. Okay, so let's go to our controller now. So let's think about the logic. We've got a transaction, and we're now looping through the accounts. If let's write this out. Okay, so we've already got part of the logic. If the nominal transaction debit nominal account equals the current account we're looking at, that's fine, that's okay. Okay, so we can actually move this inside there. So if it matches the ID, then we need to say it's just suddenly dawned on me. I'm not sure a debit and credit value for the nominal accounts is the way to go. I'm wondering whether we should just have an amount. And now that we've got this set, we know which way to show this account. So what we could say is, so how would that work in practice then? Let's take our transaction. So £120, we're going to credit that to sales. Now we now know, that's some other project completely. We now know that sales has a default of debit, of credit. So if it's a credit and the transaction is a credit, then we would add it to the balance. If it's a debit and the default is credit, we would take it from the balance, rather than just adding it to the corresponding debit or credit column. Hope that makes sense. I'm not 100%, but it sounds like a better way to do it. Let's fix that. So let's go to our nominal accounts, and we just want an amount here now, which means in our model we don't need one each of the get and set. We just need to call that get and set amount. Okay. In our database seeder, okay, so that's fine. The default is to 0 anyway. Did I change that on the migration? All accounts, default amount. Yeah. Okay, So now the only thing to do is alter this bit here, which is great. So if we're on the right account, then we need to say and we can reduce this down a bit later. If nominal, if you're still with me at this point, well done. You deserve a round of applause because I'm really exploring new areas here. If nominal account default equals debit, so what we're saying is if we're comparing the debit code at the minute, let me just comment this out and that. We're checking the debit value, and if the code is debit, then we add it to the value, so we can key amount, going to add the transaction amount, else we need to take it away. So let's get rid of that, get rid of that. Let's copy this for the credit on the transaction. Default equals credit, then we're going to add it, otherwise we're going to take it away. I hope you can follow this logic along. Let's just run through it again. We go through each of the transactions, we get the first transaction and then every subsequent transaction. So then we loop through each account. If the debit account on that transaction is the one we're looking at the minute, then we are going to do something. So we need to check if the account we're on has a default of debit. Because we're comparing the debit, that means we're adding a debit to a debit, so that is adding. But if it's not, then that means it must be a credit. So to add a debit to a credit means you're going to take it off. It's like adding a minus to a plus. So and the same the other way around. If we do the credit and it is a credit, we're adding it, otherwise we're taking it away. Again, if this works, I will be super amazed. I'm quite pleased as well. Okay, so we have a no balance. That suggests to me that I've just broken how this adds. Okay, so what I've just realised is we made the change from debit and credit to amount in the fields, but I haven't updated the code here to reflect that, so it's just passing in zeros. So we need to change this. So rather than just summing a value, we need to first of all filter it on a particular field name, which is default. So let's go back to our Laravel collections. I think we have one called map. Iterates through the collection and passes each value to a given callback. Which one do I want? Here we go. So I only want to return items in the collection that pass a given truth test, and the truth test is the name of the default field, or the value of the default field. So let's just copy this out into our code. Okay. So we have our collection already, which is nominal accounts, so we don't need that. So I'm going to do it as two separate ones first of all. Again, we'll refactor this later. So debit equals nominal accounts and filter where the value default equals debit. Okay. Then so we have to do all in order to return that, but I want to, do I need to return all before I sum? See, I could do this all in one line here. Let's not do it in one line, let's keep it easy. So debit all so now I could say sum debit equals debit all, and then sum, actually I can just type that because we're not copying most of it anyway. So will that work for sum debit? Let's try it. Okay, call to member function sum on array. Okay, so let's get rid of all. Maybe I don't need that. Oh. So that's given us a sum value, but it's left it as 0 here. That's because we're using that in the blade, the field name. We're still using the old field name of debit and credit. So we'll come back to that in a second. But this means we can copy this for credit. So we can say credit, small accounts filter where return value default equals credit, and then sum credit equals credit, and then sum the amount field. Okay, I think that's good. Let's go into our trial balance blade, and remember we had a debit and a credit and we don't have them anymore. So we only have amount, but we need to know which column to put it in. So what's going to be the easiest way to do that? Okay, let's try this. If nominal account default equals credit, then that means we can add a blank line in here. Then we can have the line with amount, and then if we do the opposite at the end, except for debit. So what we're saying is we have the nominal name, then if it's a credit value we'll put a blank column in, then we'll put the amount, but if it's a debit it won't put a blank in, so the amount will be the first column and then it'll put a blank column in the second. I think that should work. No, to put everything in the second. So that hasn't worked. So why hasn't that worked? Let's put in a C, because that equals credit, and a D, that equals debit. Let's see what that produces. That's credit. So why has that gone onto the second line? Let's have a look. So there's, is it the flex? Do we need to put flex none? Ooh, silly me. Div mass equals flex none. Let's try that. No, okay. So flex grow, flex none, flex none. Let's put the padding and everything on there as well. Padding. Yeah, okay. So it's just the flex that was wrong. So let's take out the C and the D. Should really put a non-breaking space in there. It's an ampersand, it's not a $sign. Okay. So is that working? Sales is a credit value, and it's £100. VAT is a liability, a credit value, so that's 20, that gives us our 120. The bank is a debit, and that's 120. Now suppose the proof of the pudding is, let's say we pay something out that's more than £120. What happens to this? So let's put another transaction in the migration. Well, in the seeder. Let's say we have to pay rent of £200. So 200, we're going to debit the rent, which I think I just need to make a reference to that. Yeah. Rent equals, and then we could say, right, debit the rent and credit the bank. Okay. So let's run that migration. And let's have a look at that. So what we're hoping for is the bank balance to stay in this debit column, and it does, and it's put our minus in. Now we could sort of say, let's make it more obvious if it's a minus, but we'll come back to that another time. For now, it's showing the right figure, it's just not formatting it in a great way, but it'll do for now. But what we have is our trial balance, or the makings of it, made up from the closing balance of the accounts plus the current transactions. Now on that note, let's just artificially change some of these balances. So let's say yesterday we had sales of 250, no, let's say 220, 230, 360, so let's say 300. Why is it not letting me do that? Oh, okay. So let's say sales was 300, VAT is 60, and into the bank we had 360. So let's say that was our opening balance. If we now run this, oh, I did it as pence, so it's £3. 360. I hope you can understand why I'm saving them as pence. You may just have a preference of doing it as pounds, and you can do that if you wish. So we have a sales now 400, rent of 200, that stays the same, VAT of 80, and a bank balance of £280. I am happy with that. I am happy that we are definitely on the way to this trial balance working. Well, actually it does work. What we need to do now is that we need to have an update routine that updates the closing balances for the previous day, so that we're only dealing with one day's activities. Now I'm thinking maybe in reality we'll just do it to the previous month rather than the previous day, because most accounting periods are monthly. And see, that's another thing. Are we going to tailor for accounting periods that finish on a set day of the month rather than the end of the month? Accounting periods that work weekly rather than monthly? I think for now I'm just going to go on the assumption that it's a calendar month based system. I think most businesses today find that the easiest way to do it. If there's a demand to alter that, then we'll find a way to do it. But for now I'm just going to work on calendar month basis. So at the end of a calendar month, each nominal account will have its balances updated here, and then when we run an update, or when we run a trial balance, it gets those figures, and then it'll have all the transactions from that point that haven't yet been introduced into that figure. So what that means is the transactions need to have a flag on them to say, I've already been updated into the trial balance, nominal account balance. You don't need to add me into the current list of transactions. But we'll do that in another video. For now, hopefully you've been following along, and you have your code up to date with us here. Any questions, leave a comment in the video below, and hopefully I'll follow them through later.